All right, so in this video, what we will look at is a method that components can use to communicate with each other. And the reason we're going to be doing this is because um, this is what our application currently looks like. So we have a page with two sections, one section showing a table and the other section showing a form. Now, the idea of components is that you would divide the application or each screen or each page into multiple components and then combine those components to create the interface, right? This way you don't have these extremely large HTML or single file components, all right? So the way this is done is that you divide your application into components, and how small a component is really depends on the use case within your application, right? But usually each component has one responsibility, right? So in this case, we have a component here, and it's called the user manager component, and it displays the table, which is what we have here, so it's responsible for doing view and search operations. And then this same component, user manager, is also responsible for creating the user with a user registration form, right? So what we want to do is to split this into two separate components and then link those components together, right? So the component folder is usually meant for those small components. And in the view folder, this is where you will then combine the components into one. That is not to say a component within the components folder can be made of other components. All right. It all depends on the design of your application. But in our case, since displaying the user information and creating the user, those two items are not really related. We are going to, or those two items can be clearly separated. We're going to combine them in the home component, right? So what we want to do is to split the table from the form in this user manager component to create two separate components, right? So the first thing we'll do, we will create a new component for creating the user, right? So uh, we can just call this registration form dot view. We provide this part for the template, and we'll just give it an empty div here. Good. We just put it so we know when the component loads and if that part is connected correctly. Then we use setup and then we save. All right. So what we want to do now is to just import this component here in the home component. So we say import registration registration form from at components slash registration form, right? And we'll replace this with the registration form. And let's see what our page shows. It's saying that it doesn't, it failed to resolve our component. Maybe there's a incorrect spelling or something in the name. So let's do a rename, copy the actual name from there, come to the home component, place that, oh, replace this, and replace this, right? Mm -mm -mm -mm. So it's still asking if the file exists, all right? All right, let's try this again. Import registration form from component slash registration form view. And then here we can see registration form. All right, so that import worked, and we can see the registration form is displayed there, right? The word registration form. So that is working perfectly. Now what we need to do is to migrate the actual form from the user manager component into the registration form component. So to do that, the first thing we'll do is add the correct thing here. We'll just create, I think it's just a card, right? So it's just a card we need, which is this. We copy the card, right? Now, once we copy the HTML, for it to work, we're also going to have to copy the JavaScript, all right? So it won't work with just the HTML. So if we come here, we're going to see that the entire thing is white. And if we come to inspect, when we come to console, we're going to see that there are a bunch of errors, all right? That's fine, that's expected. What we need to do now is to copy over the necessary JavaScript, and that includes everything here. Once we've imported all of this, then we'll remove what we don't need, right? What we don't need. So save. We don't need search because that's in the table, and we don't need headers, right? Got rid of both of those. We also don't need users because that's for displaying the collection of users. And we will also leave this console.log, and we'll just log user info that value, right? So that's all the submit is going to be doing. We come here, refresh. I think we still have an error or something. Let's see. All right, so no errors. Good. And it's taking up this amount of space because it's no longer constrained by the column, which is fine. So this was successfully moved to its own component. All right. Now let's do the same for the table, and we're just going to call that new file user registrations, and this is going to be the component for the table. All right. So just as before, template. I'll put a div here, and I'll just say user registrations. Then the script, we add the word setup there, and we come to home and we import that one as well, just to make sure that it's working. We say import user registrations. All right. See if this is going to work now. Good. And at the top of the registration form, we put user registrations, right? Save. And here we have the user registrations. Good. Now let's move the table from user manager to user registrations. We still have this form here, so let's get rid of this. My bad. It's the card we need to get rid of, right? And we need to copy everything from this text field all the way down to this data table. Good. And this obviously isn't going to work because we need search. We also need users and headers. All right. So if we come here, it's not going to show. See, we have no headers here, right? So we come to user manager and we'll copy this lot over to user registrations and paste that there. We also need to import the reference to ref here, and we should see, so we have an error. Let's just do a refresh to make sure it's an actual error. All right, you see we have our form, we have our table, and we have no errors here in the console. All right, good. So next, let's simply all right, so this is what we have. Now let's get back the appearance where things are centered and so on. So I'm going to copy this from user manager and I'll put it in home. All right. And then I'll copy this user registration from here, paste it there, and the registration form, I'll put that there. All right. So remember the container here, the row and the column sets up the grid structure. All right. So now it's as it was before. The only difference is this time is that the table that you're seeing at the top is in the user registrations component, and the form that you're seeing at the bottom is in the registration form component. Now, this creates a bit of an issue because previously, when you hit create in the form, it would write to this it would write to this array here, right? And this array serves as input into the table as well. And that was only possible because they're in the same component, right? Now, what we're getting into is if I have two components, how do I share data between those components, all right? Now, this is meant to just cover an introduction to Vue, and there are many ways of doing that in Vue, all right? What we're going to be doing is covering the simplest possible way, all right? So, so imagine that this here is our table, right? And this is our form, all right? What we want to do is that whenever, and then here we have our submit button, our submit button there. What we want is that whenever our submit button is clicked, all right, whenever our submit button is clicked, what we want is a message to be sent to our table so that our table update can be updated with a new record, right? It's also important to keep in mind that these two components together are all within our home component, all right? So together, these form our home component, all right? So this is something to keep in mind that these two components, the table and the form, are in our home component. Now, whenever this button is clicked, all right, you want to send the data from the form to the user registrations component. That is the one with the table. Now, the only way that can happen is if that data first passes through the home component, because the home component is the parent for both of them. All right. So what we're going to first do is allow for an event to be fired. We we've all built we know from graphical user interface programming that you have events. You have events and event handling. In Vue, you can create your components, and your components can create their own events. All right. So the way this is going to work is when when the when the button is clicked, when the orbit button is clicked, the registration form component isn't going to send a message directly to the user registrations component, the one with the table, right? Instead, it's going to send a message to the home component, right? And what we're going to do is that the home component now is then going to set up a method to react to that event, right? And then that home component is then going to set up another mechanism for updating the table. So form the form component isn't going to communicate directly with the user registrations component. The home component will serve as sort of as a middleman, right? So what we're going to do is set up an event in the form component and then allow the home component to first react to that event, all right? So if you come to the Vue documentation, you can come to events and you can go through this and learn a lot more about events, learn how to, there are a lot of nuances with this. How to send it directly from the HTML to template section. There's also a part about how to send it from the JavaScript section, right? But we'll just do one version of this, which is going to be the JS version of this, all right? So let's begin. So in order, we have to come to our form, and what we need to do is to say constant emits. This is just a variable name, right? Is equal to define emits, all right? This accepts an array, and you name the event. So let's call the event submit. So this submit here, that is the name of the event that this registration form can send, all right? And when the submit button is pressed, we say emits, we then say submit, and we can pass in the data. Now we're passing out a copy of the data, right? Which is user info.value, right? So in order to say that a component emits an event, you use define emits and you pass in an array of strings. Now this can be multiple, right? And each string in this array is then an event that this component can send. But we only have one event, so it's one. Now this emits, this is just a variable name. You can name this anything you want. And this is how you actually use it. So it's emits, then the name of the event, and the event can also pass out data, right? Now, in the home component, we have to come here and we will say at submit, right? Similar to how you were responding to at click with a button when we got those buttons from Beautify. Now this is us creating our own event, right? So at submit, and then what we can do is just provide a method that will be called when the submit button, a function will be called when that submit button is pressed. So we say add user like this, right? And we know that user, and we know that this submit event also sends data, right? So we can say user here. So when the submit event occurs, the data that was sent, which is this, is going to be passed into this function and it's going to pass through this parameter here. So let's just start with doing this dot log That should be enough. And I can say JSON.stringify to see it as a string. So what's going to happen here, once we fill up this form and we hit submit, we're going to emit a submit event with the information from the form. And then that will result in the home component to add user being called, and add user simply going to log the data that was sent back. All right. So let's see if that's going to work. Start to refresh. There's an error. All right, that's fine. No worries there. We fill this form in, and when we hit submit, when we hit this submit button, it should send an event to the home component, which should then print the information there. And as we can see, it worked. All right. Now the next step, and this basically allows you any two components can communicate this way, by the way. All right. So in this particular hierarchy, the home component is considered the parent component, and the user registrations and the registration form are considered child components of this home component. All right. So an event can be used to send data from a child component to a parent component. All right. So again, an event can be used to send data from a child component up to a parent component. All right. Now, instead of just logging the information in the home component, let's actually store it in an array. So constant users is equal to ref and that. And then instead of just logging it, we can say users.value.push is equal to user. All right. We then need to import that ref there. So we just simply say import ref from view. All right. And now, instead of just being logged to the console, it's going to add it to this list of users. Now, how do we get it into this table? So that's the next part. How do we get it into the table? All right, so let's close the form and let's look at what we have here in our table. So our table needs a list of users, right? So that it can display the users that were created. Now this, uh, let's see what we have here. Okay, good. Now this requires the use of something called props, all right? So a prop, it's what we've been calling attributes. So if we come to Vuetify documentation, for any Vuetify component, we're going to see that, here is it. We're going to see that it has some props, all right? And these are what the props look like. So you can essentially create this yourselves. Now, we've seen props before. Oh man, we've seen props before when we look at buttons. Also when we look at tables, right? So let's do the table instead. Data tables. Yes. All right. So these are all props that are part of the Vuetify data table component. So in the same way, we can create our own props, right? And just as in Vuetify, how we're using props to pass data to components, we can create our own props and use them to pass data to our own components. All right. So if you come to the view documentation, again, there's a lot of information here about props. different ways of defining them, um, how to do prop validation, the fact that from within a component you shouldn't change a prop. So if data is passed from a parent to a child through a prop, that child should not attempt to change the prop. Props should be considered to be read only, and then there are different ways of dealing with situations where the prop serves as an initial value and you want to change it, right? Two different ways of approaching that. But this is an introduction, so we'll keep things simple. And what we're going to do is use this version, right? Where we simply define a prop. So we come to our user registrations. We say constant props is equal to define props, and we provide an array, and we'll call this user, right? Well, let's call it user info. Uh, I don't want to call it user because user is too close to users, right? And we might use them interchangeably, which will then cause trouble for us. Actually, it should be users, not user, because what we'll be passing into this table is all of the users, not one user, right? So what we'll do is we'll remove this and save there. All right, good. And then now that we have that prop, we do colon users is equal to users. Now this colon users here is referring to this prop users here. All right, we don't need this right now. It's referring to this users here, right? And this users here is referring to this array of users here, right? So I just named them the same thing, right? It's the names don't have to be the same, all right? They're serving different purposes. This one within the user registration, it's the prop that allows you to pass an array called users to this user registrations so you can put it into the table. This users here is used to add the users as the submit events come out of the registration form, right? So they're not the same thing. So, so what we're doing here now is this. We have the users here, all right? And then we have a prop here called users, right? And then here we have the submit event coming out of this component, right? So when the submit event comes out of the registration form, the data is then stored in the user's array of the home component, and then that user's array is then passed now to the user's prop of the user registrations component, right? So that's the cycle. Notice it's also one way, all right? When you never want to, you can't use events between the parent and the child, right? From the parent to the child, right? That's obvious, right? And when it comes to props serve as one-way communication from the parent to the child. The child should treat props as read-only and don't manipulate them, all right? Don't mutate them. So in this version that we have here, we're using the anything that you define as a prop, and again, this is an array, so it can have multiple, is directly available in your HTML section, right? So we can use it as a standard variable in our HTML section. So let's just check to make sure that this works. Right, submit, and as you can see, it works. And as we can see, that works. All right, so we're actually passing, when this is clicked, we're passing this to the home component and then passing that the entire thing now to the user registrations, and the search should also work. All right, our search isn't working. Let's see why. What? Oh, it is working, I think, because Grant is in this name. Actually, it's not. All right, let's see here. All right, the only reason I can think about that it's not working is because this is coming from the outside. Let's just make sure it's configured properly. So search, 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 and let's just ensure that when we type, it's working. Good. So the only thing that's no, Dalmon is also, yeah, it's probably working. Dalmon is also there. Right? I need to create another one. Dalmon is also working. All right, let's try now. REN is also in here. All right, I need to PP. This is going to be unique. All right, good. Oh, whoa, multiple coincidences in rule, right? So yeah, it's working. It wasn't working before because when I type in Grant, Grant is also here. When I type in Dalmon, Dalmon is also here. When I type in Ran, Ran is also part of Grant, so it's working. Now, this is just one way of doing the props, right? In that you're using the prop directly in the users, in the HTML, right? But if you did, you can also do this. You can also say props. You can also say, sorry, constant props is equal to that. And then from within your own functions here, you can access this prop by saying, I'll just log it, console.log. I'll do json.stringify. You can say props.users, right? And there is no value, there's no users.value, it's props.users. Let me just confirm that this actually works. Let's see. Yes, so it works, all right? So yeah, so within your JavaScript, you have to use props followed by the prop name, right? Or whatever you name this variable. Period followed by the prop name. In your HTML, you can just use the name of the prop directly. All right. So in Vue, what you want to do is to divide your application into multiple components, right? Your application will actually have multiple components and multiple views. This is just a simple one. So we have a single view and two components. And you can, and one way of doing this, you have child components and parent components. All right. One way of doing this, obviously the child component is the one being imported, and the parent is the one doing the importing. All right. Now, if you want to pass data from the child component to the parent component, you can do that with an event. And if you want to pass data from the parent component to the child component, you can do so with a prop. All right. All right. And and this is and there are other ways of doing this in Vue, but this is the most common and simplest way to learn it. And unless you are really in an environment where you have to do complex processing and so on, or you have a deep hierarchy of components, this approach works just fine.